Hello and welcome to another edition of Your Therapist Needs Therapy, the podcast where two mental health professionals talk about their mental health journeys and how they navigate mental wellness while working in the mental health field. I'm your host, Jeremy Schumacher, licensed marriage and family therapist, and today I'm super stoked to have another sports performance athletics nerd with me so that we can talk about sports psych and athletics and all things that go with that. Also a local therapist, which I'm excited to connect with because there aren't a ton of us here in the Milwaukee area who do sports psych stuff. So I am joined today by Alyssa Zajdel. Alyssa, thanks for joining me.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
I'm so stoked. You cover a bunch of my kind of niche areas that I like to talk about, which is local therapist and sports performance. So first question I always ask is, how'd you get into the field of mental health? What was that journey for you?
Yeah, it's an interesting question because my mom's actually a psychologist.
Okay. So we can get a little Freudian about this?
Yeah, totally. And so I think there's pros and cons of that. So I think when you grow up with your parent in a profession, you kind of feel like, well, that's the only way to do that profession because that's just what you're familiar with.
Yeah.
And so my mom, so she's actually a very different psychologist than I am. She is a rehab psychologist. She works in the medical field and hospitals, specializes in working with older adults. And so I don't know, growing up, I was like, well, I would never want to do that. I don't really want to work in a hospital. I don't really want to work with older adults. Mm-hmm. Like, it just, I don't know, felt like not a thing for me. But I did take AP psychology in high school, and that was really interesting. But again, just kind of felt like, well, I don't want to be a psychologist the way my mom is, so I'm not going to pursue that.
Yeah.
So when I started college, I was initially like going to be a French teacher, then I was going to do international business, so kind of tried a few different things. And it's interesting because one day I was working on my calculus homework for this for the business track that I was on, and I was like, I hate this. And I look up all the requirements for the international business degree that I was working towards, and I was like, there's only like one or two classes I want to take here. So then I looked up the psychology requirements, and I was like, there's only one or two classes I don't want to take. So I was like, okay, I think this is a sign. I need to go into psychology. Mm-hmm. So I declared psychology as a major, and then I got involved in some research, and that was just really helpful to, like, it really opened my eyes to different ways that you could be a psychologist, that it didn't have to be the way my mom did it. There was just so many other ways. So I kind of found my own path. And so went from undergrad straight to a counseling psych PhD program. Mm-hmm. That was in Nebraska, which I never thought I would live in Nebraska, but then I did for 5 years.
Yeah.
And then, my career kind of took off from there. So most people I feel like don't have parents in the field. Yeah. So it's just kind of an interesting part of my journey.
Well, and it's interesting. My dad is a school guidance counselor.
Oh, uh-huh.
Which is very different than what I do. Yeah. For people in the field are aware of that. But to the average person, like, oh, psychology. Mm-hmm. So I get that question a lot of like, oh, did you go into it because of your dad? And no. Mm-hmm. But I had my dad as a AP Psych teacher.
Oh, interesting.
And so my experience with AP Psych was not as positive. And my dad would back that up. I have ADHD, and it was not diagnosed at that point in my life. So I was a good student, but a tough kid to have in class. Yeah. And my dad was also my baseball coach. So we just saw each other too much at that time of our life. But there's this idea of like psychology as a field, and unless you have a therapist, unless you have a family member who works in it, you don't have a lot of exposure to it before college. Totally. So that kind of leap of faith to major in psychology or to know what you want to do within this very wide, expansive field is really hard because other than AP Psych, it's not a high school class we take. It's not something we're really introduced to very early on.
Exactly.
Yeah. And obviously the familial relationship you have with a parent, if they're in the field, dictates whether or not you want to go into. Both my parents are teachers, so working in the education field. I knew I didn't want to be a teacher. But psychology is weird. I thought I wanted to be a psychiatrist. I was double majoring in pre-med and psychology, and similarly, sophomore year, my second semester of OChem, I was like, I don't want to keep doing this. This sucks.
Yeah.
I think it was the first time I got a C in a class, and the first time I tried in a class, and I still got a C, and I was like, this isn't for me. But I didn't know that, like, oh, therapy is what I wanted to be doing. I just thought that's what psychiatrists did. I thought that was, so, like, again, just that lack of knowledge or that lack of exposure to the field.
For sure.
Before you get into college, and then you kind of get, like, the smorgasbord of, here's a brief introduction to all of these things.
Yep, totally.
So what was that? What was the sports psych for you? Where'd that kind of start to fit into that chronology?
Yeah. Okay, yeah. So that's interesting too, because I did not know about sports psych or consider it.
Sure.
Until my last year of my graduate program, actually.
Sure.
So in grad school, I was trained as a generalist. I did like working with college students, so a lot of my kind of practicum experiences were at local university counseling centers.
Yep.
And so when you're going to get a PhD, whether that's clinical or counseling or school psychology, you have to do a year-long internship. And it's kind of like a residency. You apply to all these places. There's a match program where you rank your programs, they rank you, and then you just find out one day, like, where are you moving to? You know, so it's this whole process. But anyway, so I was on interviews for that, and I was at one school, and it was specifically the interview with the training director. And at this school, Florida Atlantic University, they had a few different rotations. So like Latinx mental health, or eating disorders, or, you know, just all these different rotations. And as part of the interview, she was asking me, like, oh, what rotation are you interested in? And I was kind of like, I don't know. A lot of them are interesting to me. I know I like working with college students and kind of perfectionism, high achievers. I mean, a lot of things that are myself.
Sure.
As I think a lot of mental health therapists do.
Yeah.
And I also have, like, my research background was in masculinity. And so kind of sharing some of these things that I already knew I was interested in. And the training director, she was a sports psychologist, and she was like, have you ever thought about sports psychology? And I was like, I haven't, no.
Yeah.
And so we just kind of started talking about it. I was like, this actually would make a lot of sense, because it's kind of putting together all these things that I'm already interested in. Plus, I grew up as a figure skater, so kind of just being in a sport like figure skating, it can be really intense.
Yeah.
And just really, I was always interested in, like, how do some people get to be so good and others don't? And I mean, there's a lot of reasons for that, like money and things like that. But just from the mental side, because especially with figure skating, like, you get one chance to go out there and try to give, like, your best performance ever, whether that's at the Olympic level, or even in figure skating, we have these tests that you take. And so you skate, you know, these required elements in front of a panel of judges, and that's really intimidating when you're the only one on the ice. These 3 judges are staring at you. And for me, I didn't know at the time that it would be called this, but I struggled a lot with performance anxiety and knew, like, oh, it was really hard for me to do these tests. And so just thinking about sports psychology, like, oh, like, that is something I totally could have used when I was a youth athlete. And just really cool to kind of use all of these things I've learned about psychology to help athletes, not only in their mental well-being and health, but also in their sports performance too. And just how with athletes, just how those go back and forth of, like, how they're doing in their sports performance impacts their mental health and wellness, and vice versa. And it just includes just all these things, especially the masculinity piece with my research.
For sure.
It's kind of interesting. So some of the women who are in my lab, we all kind of found our own ways to kind of fight the patriarchy in these, like, hyper masculine spaces. So for me, sports psych, for one of my friends, she works in the prison system, another friend at the VA. So just finding these spaces to use our knowledge of masculinity and how we view these systems. It's interesting too.
And that idea of masculinity within sports is obviously even maybe not more complex, but like it shows up in a lot of different ways.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of awareness that you can bring to the table when you know how to speak that language and assess for stuff like that and talk about some of those identity issues, because so much of that stuff is cultural. We soak it up as sponges. We're not taught it specifically, but it's still very much affecting us.
Totally. And that's something too that I find so fascinating about sports psychology is each sport is its own culture to learn. And, you know, even just thinking about figure skating, like figure skating is a whole culture. And if you're not part of that bubble, you're like, it's very easy to be like, why the heck is it like this? Or why is that the standard? Or, you know, so I think that's just something professionally that's interesting, going into different team environments and trying to learn the different cultural norms of different sports.
Yeah. Well, and then trying to do something helpful like mental health in a sport that might be hyper masculine or have this idea of like strength and like projecting strength, not showing your weaknesses or vulnerabilities. And so trying to do something like sports psych in some of those populations. Like I know I spent 5 years in higher ed working with student athletes, like working with the football team was tough to get in and had some success. But like overall, that was still really tough. Working with men's lacrosse was really tough. And not that I didn't have athletes that I worked with. There weren't people, there were people who sought me out, but that team culture, that sport culture around some of these sports was really tough, because it was just like, oh, well, I don't want my teammates to see me going into your office, first of all. But also, like, if I'm not, like, tough all the time, like, what happens? And so, exactly. I can imagine all these applications for the masculinity studies and that research background you had in sports.
Totally.
Yeah, that's so fascinating. What was your sports background? I mean, figure skating, how far did you take that? What was that kind of like, as far as you said, like, it would have been nice to have someone doing this stuff in your youth. Where did sports kind of take you?
So I started figure skating very, very late for the culture.
Sure.
Most people start skating when they're like 3 or 4.
Yeah.
Like I had friends and teammates who were like, I don't even remember not ever being able to skate. You know, like they learned to walk and learned to skate like at the same time. So I was 11 when I started, so quite late. And it's interesting when I think it brought up a lot of insecurity, because you're 11 and you're in these learn to skate classes with 5-year-olds. And you're like, oh my gosh. Or like, I remember this one time, this was when I was in a learn to skate class that was a little more advanced, but there was like a 7-year-old like doing laps around me. And I'm like, ooh, like this does not feel great. But I think, kind of speaks to just how much I loved the sport, that I just kept with it, even through some of that like embarrassing or just weird dynamics. And what I was really attracted to was synchronized skating. So this is where you have a team of like 10 to 16 or so skater. It can vary, but and you're all performing on the ice together. And when I was in Learn to Skate, it was Thursday nights, and that's when some of the local synchro teams practiced. And this was at the Pettit, so you could see there's lots of things going on at once. So I would always see these like synchronized skating teams, and I was like, that is so cool, I want to do that. So eventually got to a level where I was able to try out. So I did that for a few years in high school. And then in college, I didn't do synchro, although I did have the option. I went to UW-Madison, and I did select my undergraduate based on if they had some skating programs. So I didn't do the synchro because I wanted a little more flexibility to just kind of make whatever my college experience was my own. And when you do a team sport, obviously you have to adhere to their practice times and all that kind of stuff. But there was this new thing starting called intercollegiate figure skating. And so you're still, like, you're skating individually, like your own program at your own level, but you could earn points for your team, and then, you know, by the end of the day, you know, whichever teams had the most points would win. And so ended up doing that, made some really good friends. It was really fun, really casual. And with that, we made it to nationals a few times, and I even medaled nationally, which was just so fun. And so, I kind of ended my own personal, like, competitive career, I guess, after college, but I do still skate even now. I just came from a lesson this morning.
Nice.
So I am still skating, trying to finish up those tests that I mentioned.
Yeah.
So I have one test left in kind of the skating skills track. And yeah, it's a lot harder as an adult, and I have to do a lot more work in the gym to kind of support,
Sure. Yeah.
support my skating. But it's fun to, and I guess it's been fun too to just see the growth in the sport, and just make it my own as an adult coming back versus like what it was like when you're a kid in sports. Like sometimes you're not fully aware of the dynamics happening at the rink, or you know, I was hypersensitive about, I know I'm not as good as other people my age, and even on these synchro teams I always felt like the worst skater, which in some ways was great because then I was pushed a lot, and my skill level would not be where it was if I wasn't on these teams where I had to really skate up and work so hard. But I think like mentally it was just kind of draining at times to be like, everyone else is getting this so easily and I'm not. And just feeling, I think as a kid I kind of internalized some of that of like, well, I'm a bad skater or there's something wrong with me. And in like as an adult really working through that, and like that's not the case when someone else has 6 years on you. Like of course there's going to be a difference,
and such an individual sport. And you know, it's a unique setup compared to a lot of team sports that are based on age. It's you're not being separated by skill level, you're being separated by age. So you know, I coach volleyball, and a bunch of kids start around 10 or 11. Some kids have been playing for 3 or 4 years already. Some kids started at 14, 15, and then they're way behind. Way behind sounds bad, but like, you know, they're lacking this experience, but you're still set up by age as opposed to skill level. And so I can see where that individual nature of the sport, and then also based on skill level as opposed to age, is very intimidating at an age where we're like growing and awkward with our bodies still, and like all that stuff. That's so, I don't know a lot about figure skating, so I want to ask a ton of follow-up questions. But it's also, I think, kind of parallels some of the experience with sports psych of like, it's pretty niche. It's you know, Madison, you went to UW-Madison, probably had a sports psychologist on staff with the football team, but I don't know about much more than that. You know, and it's a weird profession because it's a thing that we almost always know. People have been talking about the mental part of athletics for ages, but the resources are very limited. Pro sports teams, by and large, all have them. D1 sports programs, by and large, have them now, although I would say probably not all of them still. Let alone D2, D3, and then moving into the club or youth sports. Like, it's super hard to tap into those resources. It's always been my dream to build a mental health facility that mirrors what a D1 athlete gets. Because those resources are like incredible, and it's odd that we just have those for athletes. Super necessary for athletes, but like super necessary for regular folks too. Like to have all that stuff that you can access, the D1 resources of a nutritionist and a psychologist on staff and a dentist and advisors for your classes and stuff. Like all those experiences are super helpful. I think competing at the college level too is really relevant when you're doing sports psych, because each level that you participate in is a little different. Collegiate sports are different than club sports. Club sports are different than high school sports. So like all of these nuances, even within the same sport, that it's really hard to relate to. I related to a lot of my student athletes that I worked with because I suffered an injury, and that's really hard mentally. And if I hadn't experienced, like, I walked away from baseball because I needed to have surgery, and we didn't know what was wrong, and we didn't know if I'd be able to play again. And I was pretty burnt out. I started playing baseball when I was 4, and as a pitcher, and I had shoulder problems. So, like, that sucks. Really hard to do that. And I took a couple years away from baseball, and then I was a walk-on at Minnesota to play volleyball. So, like, it was this weird kind of thing where I thought my athletic career was over. And then kind of fell in love with this new sport that I had enough natural talent from a lot of arm speed of playing baseball that I could translate, but like was really rough. Like I was a project player when I was in college. And so, but again, I think that experience is super helpful. My experience with sports psych is very based on just like my athletic career and then coaching volleyball and then eventually getting to that point where I was doing mental health for student athletes in the collegiate setting, but also recruiting players because I coached. And so like knowing the recruiting ins and outs, like there's all these stressors that athletes deal with that aren't just how do they perform on game day.
Yeah, for sure. Sure. And that's something, so yes, I skated in college, but it was a club sport, so I wasn't a varsity athlete. So that is something that, I mean, even now I'm still learning some of the ins and outs of recruiting, even though I have worked into D1 universities with student athletes. But yeah, it's a whole other world.
Yeah. And it's a different world at D2 and D3. Like,
yep, exactly.
Again, all of these different nuances and levels that can affect people, the level of resources that a D1 athlete has access to versus a D3 athlete who's not on scholarship and maybe academic, but not athletic scholarship and still trying to do a full-time sport. And like, it's crazy.
Totally. And even the variation within programs. So, a D1 university like UW-Madison or Minnesota that has these like amazing teams that bring in a lot of revenue is very different than one of the D1 programs I worked at was Jacksonville University. And it was kind of surprising it was a D1 because it's a small liberal arts college and they don't have necessarily like a huge football team with a big stadium that's bringing in so much money.
Right.
And so I think it's tough for those types of programs too to try to keep up with the Wisconsins or all these huge like the Floridas. It's hard for them to keep up but try to deliver the same support for their athletes who are competing with these other student athletes, but not having the same amount of resources.
And that can be just little things from like gym time and when your practices are scheduled and when you have to schedule your classes around your practice time because football or wrestling or whatever big sport is bringing in the money is going to get the priority. Totally. And depending on what the space looks like when I was at Minnesota, the football team wasn't good, but still brought in a lot of money. Wrestling was an incredible sport and women's volleyball was an incredible sport. Playing men's volleyball, which was also a club sport at that time. Men's volleyball has come a long way in 15 years. Totally. But like we practiced at 9:30 p.m. Totally. Like we practiced from 9:30 to 11:30. Like that's not an ideal setup for a college student. I was a night owl, so I didn't mind. I'd stay up anyway. But like for somebody who's maybe in a tougher major, not that's like psychology is an easy major. Let's not lie about it. But like at a rigorous university like Minnesota or Madison, like there's a lot that still goes into it. So like even just something like scheduling can be hectic if you're in that top tier sport or you're in one of the middle level sports. You might be a D1 athlete who's on scholarship, but still be having some strain from being in that sport because of when practices is or when your classes, especially when you get into junior and senior year and you need to be taking certain classes to get your degree. Totally. If you're a cross-country runner, you're a gymnast, like you might not be going pro in your sport. There might not be a pro to go to. And so like you need your major, but you don't want to miss out on the couple of years you have left of competitive sport. So like there's so much that goes into balancing all that. It's not just show up on game day and can you perform or not.
Exactly.
Yeah. It's also fascinating. So now you have your own practice. What was our journey from PhD, grad program, doing those internships, those placements to where you are now?
From Nebraska we moved to Florida. I worked at Florida Atlantic University and then Jacksonville University for my postdoc.
FAU's D1 as well, right?
Learned a lot, especially working at Jacksonville University because I was kind of setting up the sports psychology program.
Sure.
There's a lot of different ways that universities will set up the sports psych services. At Jacksonville University, I was housed in the counseling center, but was a liaison with athletics, and so worked with them in that capacity. But this was kind of during the pandemic too, so my husband and I got to a point where we're like, it might be time to move back home. We're both from the Wisconsin area, Milwaukee area. So we moved back here, I think that was 2022 probably. And I joined a group practice to just kind of get started. Did some adjunct teaching at Marquette University, which I really love. I love teaching. And this group practice just wasn't the best fit. It wasn't providing kind of the supports that I needed and or that I thought I was going to get by being part of a group practice. And also just some of the ways that it was organized just didn't kind of fit with the way that my brain works or the product that I wanted to give to clients. So last year started my own practice, Inside Edge Counseling and Consulting, which the name is interesting. It comes from skating. So in figure skating, you skate on your inside edge or your outside edge. And I kind of liked that it was, I don't know, is it a double entendre or something of like a good metaphor for sports psychology, and that an inside edge is like one of the main skills you have to learn before you can learn anything advanced. You have to have a really solid inside edge. But then also, you know, sports psychology is kind of this quote unquote like new frontier-ish. Of how do you work on internal mental skills rather than just the physical skills, because all athletes focus on the physical skills, but not all athletes focus on the mental training side. And so just thinking, okay, with the name Inside Edge, like how do you get the edge from the inside work that you do? So it's been really fun, a big learning curve to be a business owner. For sure. But it's been really great, and just working with athletes locally, and I also have some licensure in other states, so doing some telehealth and stuff as well.
I'm curious because you had a more advanced degree than I or most of my guests have had. Was there any like training for business? Was there any prep on?
No.
Yeah. Which some programs do, but what I hear from most people is like they're ill prepared for it. If you want to open your own practice, if you want to do your own thing, like you are learning on the fly because we're not taught that stuff in school.
Exactly. Yeah. In my grad program, there were a few events where it's like not necessarily the ins and outs of the business, but more how do you know if private practice is right for you? And like some mentions of like, yeah, you have to do some business stuff, but like nothing specific. When I was on internship, we did have a seminar, so like a one-time workshop where the person did say, okay, you need to get this license, like this business license, and you need to get an EIN number and, you know, some of these things. But even still, that was not enough to start up. So, I mean, luckily there's a lot of resources out there. And I think what's nice about our field is we will mentor each other, you know? So like, I know for me, getting help from people who had already established their private practice, who are friends or colleagues, and now I know I'm doing that, like helping other people who are starting. But it would be helpful to actually get some business training to do this. So
and I think, I mean, I have loved having my own practice. It's coming up on 2 years since opening my own place, and I've loved it. But like even 2.5 years ago, 3 years ago, let alone 12 years ago, whenever I started in the field, I've been doing this for 15 years. I thought for most of my career, that sounds awful. I would never want to do that. I'm not business minded. Like that's such a big learning curve. I don't want to mess with any of that stuff. I'll screw something up. I'm ADHD, like all this stuff. And like, you get into it and there's a learning curve. And yes, there's things that I screwed up and needed to fix, but like there are so many resources out there. There are a lot of things that, and some of them are predatory, I will caution, but like there are a lot of things for other therapists to coach you or take workshops or whatever. I tend to tell people don't overspend on that because there's like, you're just trying to get over your anxiety. Paying for another training is not going to do that.
For sure.
But like, it is nice to get, you know, here's somebody who's been in the field who has a lawyer approved set of paperwork and you can have that template and to go through some of that stuff that you don't know until you do it. And it saves you some headache and saves you some time.
For sure.
As far as like LLC or S Corp and all that stuff, like, you know, I found that's really minutia that doesn't super impact a ton. You can hang your shingle and start seeing clients. You want to have that stuff figured out, but like you have time to adjust that stuff. You have time to come back. And that was the stuff that I really thought was going to be prohibitive. And like that was the stuff that took me a week, you know, I'm not saying that it's not nothing, but like it was pretty minimal. It was Google searching and checking with one or two people who I trusted and then being okay with it.
For sure. Yeah. I think it's really easy to build up how much there is. I mean, there is a lot to learn. Like, even I met with a lawyer yesterday for the first time because I want to get a lawyer to look at some of my paperwork, because I kind of just DIY. I mean, I took like this friends and you know, kind of put some stuff together, but wanting to make sure now that I have more clients in my practice that I am legally protecting myself. And even that it is a little overwhelming, because they're even down to like, oh, do you want to trademark your logo? And I was like, I guess that's maybe, sure, if there's benefits, but that's also last on the list. I want to just make sure that my license is protected at this point with my paperwork and you know, things like that. So but I agree with what you're saying. Like, there's so many supports out there, and just finding the right supports that are trustworthy can really be beneficial.
Sports psych is an interesting niche to have. I mean, I interviewed at UConn, so like I'm going to use UConn as example just because I happen to know it off the top of my head. But like, their sports psychologists on staff are LCSWs, like the people, and like, I'm not interested in the competitive nature of whose degree is better. I think that's a bad question based on a bad premise. Totally. But like, for the field, it's relatively new, where like people who can get a doctoral program in it is not, those programs aren't that old. There aren't a ton of them. So a lot of people who have been in the field for a long time are just your LCSWs, or they happened to be an athlete who then majored in psychology and went back to grad school for it. So like, a lot of it is this mix of like personal experience and then building the academia almost after the fact. And so I think it's interesting, when I was in higher ed, like I taught a couple psych classes, and the number of students were like, I didn't know this is a thing. Like, where are the programs? And I was like, well, there's like 7 of them. Totally. But like, you know, I think it is good for people to be introduced to the concept, see that there is some academic stuff, be able to decide, do you want to take kind of that kinesiology, PT type approach and go that way, or do you want to take the psych approach and go that way? Like, so even now there's some different kind of roadmaps for how to get into the field, which I think is really good. For sure. But yeah, it's really centered around college or professional sports teams.
For sure.
And so like, yeah, I think it's fascinating to be trying to connect with local sports, something like the Pettit in Milwaukee, which is where, you know, we have Olympians training and like it's a big facility, but if you're not familiar with either the Milwaukee area or ice skating, there's no reason to know about it.
Exactly.
It's niche again. Like it's just kind of this interesting thing. So I think it's fascinating to get to chat with you on like, there's all these, I don't want to say hurdles, but like there's all these things to be aware of, and like doing private practice and doing a pretty niche area. Like there's just a lot that goes into that.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. And I think you're right with sports psych. Yeah, there's not exactly one clear path to get to it, which I think in some ways is cool. Like, it's a really exciting time in sports psychology. I mean, I am most familiar with like the D1 athletics, and private practice now, but D1 athletics sphere. But I think there's like more positions that they're hiring for than people. Because everyone's just getting to this place where, yes, we need mental health providers. We need to work on sports psychology skills. And so departments are starting to invest in it more, which is amazing. But then it is also tricky when we don't have enough people to fill, or people who, I think it is tricky, like, how do you know you're qualified to do sports psychology work, which is just a big question in the field, and they're trying to address that. There is the CMPC, Certified Mental Performance Consultant, which I do have, which was a great experience, but it costs money, and I had to take 2 graduate courses after I already completed my PhD, which I was like, oh my gosh, I thought I was done with school, but now I'm taking these 2 more like graduate level courses. So there were some hurdles, but I do appreciate that they're trying to standardize a little bit, or say like, okay, there's these certifications that you can say for sure, like, yes, I am a qualified sports like performance practitioner.
And I mean, that even gets really interesting thinking about accrediting bodies, but like international sports are so different than American sports too. So I mean, I remember when I was in the sports psych field specifically, like looking at other countries and like just being like, what the fuck is going on over there? Like for volleyball, like there aren't youth programs. Like they don't really start until 16, 17, 18. And like, that's so bizarre for somebody who comes from like the American side of things, where like we started like 10 or earlier, and like you're committed to your D1 sports program by 15 or 16. For like, sure. So just so like, yeah, it's an interesting, growing, developing field. I do think I walk that paradoxical sort of space of like the standardization is important, and we also have had people in these positions for years who might not like fit that, or like I have to go back and take some classes. I remember when I looked into one of the accreditations, I don't remember what it was. It was like I had no PT background, so like there were a bunch of kinesiology classes, and like that makes sense that I should learn that stuff, and I have no interest in learning that stuff.
That was one of the courses I had to take, was like an advanced kinesiology.
And like, you know, I think you probably experienced this similarly, because I had to build my department as well, which is not a thing I recommend to people. But like, I got really tight with the athletic training department. I'm a collaborative person, so like building those connections, having those supports where it was like I was aware I was lacking some of that information, and rather than go back to school for it, connecting with the people who already had that information and building a collaborative team so that we could do that stuff.
For sure.
I think, you know, I talk about Ohio State as kind of that gold standard. Not for any reason other than they have a shit ton of money in their sports programs. But like they have 5 psychologists just for their football team. They have a ton of resources on campus for their students. They're doing a ton of research around this stuff because they have a ton of money. And so like, that's really good. But like, I was at an institution that had 800 student athletes, which is what Ohio State has. I was at a D3 institution that had no money for sports psych compared to Ohio State with 800 student athletes and billions of dollars. So it's a very different experience when you're trying to do some of that stuff. I think for not just looking at the athletes, but looking at the professional side of it, for us psychologists, like counseling centers are understaffed.
Yeah, for sure.
Counseling centers are underfunded. And then if you're going into sports psych, like if you're at a new program, I was building my program from scratch. Like not only did I have to work through COVID and all these student athletes who lost their main support system and their main coping skills when they couldn't do their sport, but also I'm fighting for funding. I'm trying to do all the like tedious stuff behind the scenes, and something like COVID really threw a wrench in what programs had for money. We're spending all this money on testing, which was good and necessary, but also like funding that people didn't have or had it earmarked for other things. So it was like this really draining, for me as a provider, it was a really draining experience to do kind of the like behind the scenes departmental stuff.
I agree.
And I fought really hard to be housed in athletics instead of counseling, because the D3 counseling center was not a good place to be. But like that created its own headaches too.
For sure.
And even just the little minutia of like, my athletes did not want to go to the counseling center. And I was a coach at the time, so I had my coaching office, but I shared it with the other coaches. It's like, where's confidentiality? I'm in the conference room, but oh shit, football has recruits on staff. So now the conference room is taken. Like, guess we're going in the wrestling mezzanine, but like, that's not super, like, totally. So it's just this like back and like all these little things that again, like grad school didn't prepare me for any of that.
For sure.
You know, like, and I'm doing like paperwork and I'm doing confidentiality stuff on the back end, which is not how we should be doing it as providers. And just kind of like trying to meet this need that was super pressing, that also not having the resources or being able to do the work that I wanted to be doing, trying to do research so that I could get more funding, like all these moving parts. And then like shockingly burning out at the end of that, because working through COVID in higher ed was a nightmare. In and of itself, let alone doing athletics through that.
Yeah, no, I resonate a lot. I mean, there's a reason why I'm not at, we have plenty of universities around here, and when I was job searching, there were even some... You adjuncted at Marquette, There are some job openings that I could have applied to, but I kind of got burnt out, just like you did. And it wasn't, because of the student athletes. But I think, too, what's hard, and maybe this goes back to some of that masculinity, like, aspects of, athletic departments are very hyper masculine, patriarchal, like depend on capitalism, and like whiteness. There's so many systems systemically that impact the culture of athletics as a whole. And so because of all those things, there's a lot of stigma about mental health and mental skills. And so you know, in some ways it was really hard getting the buy-in from, like, some coaches were so on board. They're like, oh yes, and you know, they'll, you know, really easily refer athletes. But some coaches just kind of didn't get it, or thought that like athletes just had to suck it up, or you know, there's also an issue like coaches would refer someone and be like, well, fix them in like 1 or 2 sessions. I need them to perform like in 2 weeks. And I'm like, you're asking the impossible. You're not gonna like fix an athlete's mental health and performance concerns in 2 sessions, you know? And then I think too, you know, the culture of athletics is a very kind of open. They had a hard time understanding confidentiality, at least at my institution, in especially too, even with the athletic trainers who have some confidentiality with their license. But it's interesting because they have athletes sign ROIs. So like there is just kind of this culture of, you know, we share things with whoever. And from a mental health perspective, that's not helpful. I mean, some athletes do want their coaches or their athletic trainers or whoever to be informed. But some athletes don't want anyone to know that they're getting mental health help for just a wide variety of reasons. And that was something that I think was just kind of hard to really get everyone on board of. I think there can be tension with mental health providers because they're like, why, like the athletics staff might feel like, well, why are you keeping these secrets? We're just trying to help the athletes. Like, why wouldn't you tell us that or confirm that they came to 5 sessions or whatever? And it's like, well, if the athlete's not giving me permission to do that, and there's very valid reasons why they might not, like I literally legally cannot say anything. And I think that can be a real turnoff sometimes to athletics professionals who are just not, you know, used to or don't have the same, like a coach doesn't have legal, you know, like laws that are dictating what they can and cannot say to whoever. So just a hard time understanding. So I mean, I did a lot of some of that education in the department, and I think it was helpful. And there were some great partners that got it and were so supportive. But there's some people too that just were having a hard time just understanding what we did, like what I was doing as a psychologist.
I think administrative buy-in's tough. I think definitely like machismo and like masculinity in certain sports, but I would say even like regardless of gender, I was dealing with like that old school coaching mentality of like, yo, you can't make your kids run until they puke, like that's abuse. And like then how am I supposed to coach them? And like I would just like kind of be like, I can answer that question, but like the fact that you're asking that question is problematic. Or like, oh, well, like this kid broke rules, but like they're our best player. So what are we supposed to do? Like, and like I was a coach at the same time. So like at D3 level, there's that blurry boundary of like, I'm wearing a ton of hats because there's not enough staffing. But yeah, it was really tough. I had to do a lot of psychoeducation with the coaches and the administration first, like things like Title IX and being like, yo, like we don't mix, like those things are kept separate on purpose. Like I have issues with the way Title IX gets handled separately from that, but like it is different. And like regular coaches, athletic directors don't know the ins and outs of the legality of that stuff. Being housed in athletics versus the counseling center was what I wanted and I pushed for. But I also had to explain a lot of things then of like, oh no, like I can't do that. Or like coaches, stop pressuring your kids to sign releases. If they don't want to do it, they shouldn't. And you like pressuring them, they're going to, because they don't want you to be mad at them. And like that's defeating the purpose. Or like, you know, hazing, kangaroo courts, like some of these things that are that old kind of traditional stuff in certain sports programs, like, oh, the freshmen have to carry the bags. Like, that's not okay. We can't do that anymore. Like, there's legal ramifications for that stuff. I have to report that stuff. So y'all have to like clean this up and like just that. Yeah, there's a lot of stuff that goes into setting that stuff up, which like those are good changes that need to happen in athletics. I'm not complaining about it. I'm saying there's so much institutional resistance to some of these things, especially if you have a very macho AD who's old school in their mentality of let's hell week for football and these kids should be puking and we're going to restrict their water and like no, none of that stuff's legal. Like we can't be doing that stuff anymore.
Yeah, exactly. And yeah, definitely needed changes. And I think what we're both speaking to is like when you're the only practitioner in the system, like it's very easy to burn out.
Yes.
And that's what I'm appreciating too about some of the growth that's happening in sports psych. A lot of these institutions are starting to hire more than one provider, and to have a team. Because I think, just in mental health in general, like you need to consult and like having a team is helpful. But especially when you're going up against all this systemic institutional stuff, it's really necessary to have a team.
Yeah. And you want to be, if you're that only provider, you're trying to get on everyone's good side.
Yeah.
Like that's not the goal, but that's obviously super helpful to getting those goals.
Yeah.
So you don't want to like piss off a coach who's then going to speak poorly of you to their team, and then you're like cut off from those athletes.
Totally. And I think one tricky aspect, so with sports, like the ethics are a little different in some ways or there's just nuances to ethics compared to what you're traditionally trained on, because you are doing a lot more outreach. You are kind of hanging around sometimes. Like there's times I'm just sitting at basketball practice and just like being present, when traditionally in mental health you're trained, like you sit in your office, people come to you, you don't go out to them. So there's just some difficulties, and even with that, like, I totally found myself trying to people please and get on people's good sides, but then that's murky too, because especially if you're working with athletes who have problems with a coach, you don't want to be presenting as like, well, I'm going to take the coach's side, because then you're not a safe person to come talk to them, or if the coach is being abusive or problematic. So it's a really fine balance, and that's why I think a team can be so helpful, is like, okay, well, I'll support the athletes on this team, you support the coach, so we can kind of divide and conquer, and so it's not as blurry or having as many dual roles. But I know like in D3 or just with resources, you are wearing a lot of hats, and you do have to hold all of those things at once, and it's tricky. Yeah,
for sure. So hopefully the field keeps growing and adding some of these safeguards. And like, again, some of that structure will get sorted out. Like there were things I ended up liking seeing athletes in the mezzanine where the wrestling mats were, like, especially the wrestlers liked meeting me there. That's where they were comfortable. Totally. So as long as I could make sure I was there in an off time where there was no one else there, like it ended up working out really well. And that started to shift some of my stuffiness around how to do therapy. That has translated into how I do therapy now in my own practice, where like there's a bike path behind my office. We'll do some walk and talk therapy, and like we'll do some different things that grad school didn't teach me or taught me. Was like, oh, well, what if you get sued? Like, and learning how to navigate the proper procedure to do it, so you're not going to get sued, but also you can meet your clients' needs where they're at.
For sure, yes. I have also met with clients in equipment rooms or like the just random spaces that you would not like, that we did not learn about in our graduate programs.
Yep, for sure. So this is a very ADHD conversation where we're just covering a lot of ground. What does self-care look like for you now? What's the work-life balance? You've had all these experiences that are super interesting and we could spend hours talking about, but like, what are you doing now? How do you take care of yourself? How are you practicing what you preach?
Going to my own therapy is super helpful.
The name of the podcast. Hooray.
Exactly. My own therapy. I'm finally finding a therapist who is just like such a good fit.
Sure.
Has been so helpful. And it even helps me professionally. I'm doing a lot of personal work on holding boundaries and working on my people pleasing and stuff. And, that comes up all the time with clients, even with scheduling of holding some boundaries, like, and it gets hard like with athletes.
Cancellation policy.
Yeah, the cancellation policy. Yeah. Even just like, ideally I would not like to see clients at night because that's when I need to rest. But also student athletes that I'm meeting with, like their schedules are so wild that sometimes you just kind of have to squeeze things in.
Right.
But just, learning for myself to be purposeful in when am I, when do I need to hold my boundaries for my own well-being, and when is there some flexibility?
Yeah.
So that also, I've been really big into my morning routine.
Mm-hmm.
I don't have kids, so I know it would totally be different if I had kids, but because I don't, I can kind of just really, I don't know, have this like solid morning routine. So I go to the gym, I weightlift, I love doing that. I come home, I feed my dog, I meditate.
Yeah.
Then I have my breakfast and play my New York Times games, and then I get ready for the day. And I've just found like just having some of that quiet space, and especially like meditation built in, super helpful. We could totally do a whole nother podcast on injury, because I also have an injury, and I've had an injury, and I like working with athletes with injury, kind of like you were saying earlier too, from your own experiences. But even just finding meditation helpful for my own injury, process has been amazing. So just really making sure to build that time in. And then, working out, I skate, spending time with friends, and my husband and my dog, and yeah.
What kind of dog do you have?
A Yorkie Poodle Pomeranian.
Sounds so bougie.
Yeah,
what a bougie breed.
It does. Yeah, she's a little 10-pound.
Sure.
Little spunky thing.
Yeah, that's right. I have a long-haired Chihuahua. We have a big dog and a little dog, and our long-haired Chihuahua knows he's got a beautiful coat, and he's kind of high maintenance.
Yeah, exactly.
Very cool. Yeah, and you mentioned before, like connecting with peers, like that support system within the field is also super important.
Yeah, which especially that's been something. I wish I would have done this sooner. Well, like I was saying earlier, I joined this group practice with the hope of one of the benefits would be to have regular consultation and like just built-in colleagues who are all in the same space, and it just didn't pan out that way. And so just kind of realized like I have to actually I can create these spaces. So I have some like a consultation group with some grad school friends, and they're also working on starting their private practices. So it kind of alternates between talking about clients, consulting about that to become better therapists, but then also just talking about this business stuff. It's been really nice just to have a space for that. And so, just building in time to consult with colleagues has just been so helpful, especially in the private practice space, because you can feel so isolated.
Yeah, for sure.
When you're in your own practice.
Yeah. At first, it seems really nice.
Yeah, right? No drama when it's just yourself.
Especially if you're coming out of like a bad agency fit.
Yeah,
so after higher ed, I went to an agency for about 8 months, and it was not a good fit. And just that burnout from higher ed and then having a not good fit right away was like, oh.
Yep.
So that breathing space. I would say for like that first year I had my own business. It was just like I was so happy on my own, doing my own thing.
Sure.
And the second year has been collaborating, connecting. It's part of where the podcast came from, was like my networking, forcing myself to network. Yeah. So building that group of people who, and if you're in a niche area, you need your experts in what you're an expert in. And then you might have other people who are local, or you might have other people who do the private practice thing or whatever. And so you kind of build these different groups for different things.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. So tell us, we're going to wrap up shortly here, but tell us, here's your pitch. Who are your ideal clients, these athletes out there who you're like, these are my people. These are who I want to connect with.
Yeah. So I do work with mostly athletes, but also other high performers. I specialize in anxiety, sports performance, obviously, and confidence. Yeah. So we'll work with people who aren't athletes, who struggle with confidence. And as far as the high performers, I mean, that could be like musical performance, that could be workplace, like if you're a doctor, or I've worked with med students or law students, just anyone who's in these roles where you have to be on and it feels hard to do that. I can help you build the confidence or work through. I do a lot of performance anxiety work. Just build up some of the skills to perform when you need to in whatever performance area you're in.
I pull from my background in sports performance often with like a lot of people who are in these high stress, very high on the corporate ladder. And you wouldn't necessarily think of it as like performance psychology, but like I apply a lot of the same principles, because again, it's that are you showing up? Can you be on when you need to be?
Yep, exactly.
Yeah. Very cool. All right. Inside Edge Counseling. If people want to connect with you, if they want to work with you, if they want to learn more about you, where do they go? How do they find your stuff?
My website has everything. So, which is just insideedgecounseling.com.
Mm-hmm.
And you can find out more about me and the work I do. I have a blog where I share some information about anxiety, confidence, a lot of sports psych stuff as well, and just like kind of a therapy 101.
Sure, for sure.
As well. And that's where you can, just find out more about me. And if you want to work with me, you can fill out my introduction form and you can get started. So that's the best place. Yeah,
very cool. We'll have that in the show notes so people can find it and follow that easily. Alyssa, thanks so much for joining me today.
Much. It's been amazing.
And to all our wonderful listeners, thanks for tuning in again. We'll be back next week with another new episode. Take care, everyone.